Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Speed Bumps on the Road to Decarbonization. This is a review of the J.P. Morgan Net Zero Target Report, a summary by Robert Lyman, and I'll just be walking through a PowerPoint. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. I'm the Communications Manager. And just to give you a bit of background about us, Friends of Science Society is a small nonprofit society based in Alberta, and we're made up of earth, atmospheric, and solar scientists and business people and citizens. And what our main focus is providing insights on climate science and related energy policies. And that's what we're going to be looking at tonight, is some of the energy policies related to Net Zero 2050. So I don't know if you know, but you can become a member of Friends of Science. There's a membership button on our website. You can donate if you like the work that we do. And you can certainly join in our conversation on any of our social media platforms. We're quite active on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, also Instagram. And we have a very active YouTube page. So all those things are free to you to enjoy or not enjoy. We encourage people to engage in open civil debate on climate and energy policies. And we don't want you to agree. We want you to think about what we offer and to discuss it with the people that we engage with. So without much further ado, let's get into this presentation here. So Speed Bumps on the Road to Decarbonization comes out of a report that J.P. Morgan did. And it was certainly timely that Robert Lyman put together this summary of highlights from the J.P. Morgan report, because right after that, what happened is the IEA just issued their own Net Zero by 2050 roadmap. And they have some pretty fantastic goals, which they seem to think are quite achievable. And the J.P. Morgan report was written prior to the release of the IEA report. So you'll find some contradictions as we go along today. If we look at what the IEA is proposing, they're saying that renewable energy is ever cheaper, that it will give electricity the edge in the race to zero. Look at what they call for scaling up wind and solar rapidly from to 630 gigawatts of solar photovoltaics, and 390 gigawatts of wind by 2030, 4 times the record levels set in 2020. So I just want you to remember that all those things have to be made with something. Keep in mind what that something is that makes those things. And if we go down here to the bottom, we can see that they think electric vehicles, EVs, will go from 5% of global car sales to more than 60 by 2030. That's a pretty big reach in my view. And not only me. Here's an energy expert, Anas Al-Haji. He's very prominent on our Twitter feed, and he's got some really great comments here. The IEA in 2020 said it would be wrong to cut investment in oil and gas because it will still be needed for years to come. Then Fatih Birol, who's the executive director of the IEA in 2020, said, our message to the oil industry here in Houston is invest, invest, invest. And the IEA in 2021, ignore what I said in the past. So that's kind of a good summary of how unrealistic and how ridiculous the IEA report is. And, you know, there's that saying, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. In the Telegraph today, there was an article by Ambrose Evans Pritchard, and he said that net zero makes us richer, cuts energy costs for the poor, and we'll evaluate that as we go along today. He said it would replace 5 million jobs lost in oil, gas, and coal with 8 times as many jobs for engineers, electrical experts, offshore operators, solar technicians, lithium and rare earth miners. He also claims that it does not raise the cost of energy, and even goes so far as to say this is tantamount to free energy. Well, I'm sure you've all heard the saying that nothing's free. There's no free lunch. So let's have a look at the PowerPoint of this presentation, of this report. So if we go to the overview here, we can see that most world leaders have endorsed the net zero 2050 targets. You can see on the side here, here's a picture of the cover of the JP Morgan report. And the investment firm JP Morgan published this 2021 annual energy paper. It's one of the more woke investment companies in the United States and one that does support the decarbonization agenda, but the paper examines the technological and economic barriers to the goal of decarbonization. So author Michael Chimbalist worked with Václav Smil, and Smil wrote over 40 books on energy, and he's an emeritus professor from the University of Manitoba. He's also commonly known as one of Bill Gates' favorite authors on energy. And Robert Lyman is a Canadian energy economist, and so he's written up a short summary of the highlights of the JP Morgan report, and we published it under the name of Speed Bumps on the Road to Decarbonization, and that's what we will be reviewing this evening. So we're going to be reviewing Robert Lyman's highlights drawn from the JP Morgan report, and Robert promises that this is just part one, so there's much more to come. But the JP Morgan report for average people is a bit dense in terms of information, and you might need some special understanding of energy markets to really get the gist. So Robert Lyman has done that for us. So let's go have a look at what he has offered. Here's Michael Chimbalist, by the way, just so that you see he's quite an expert in his field, 34 years with JP Morgan, chairman of Market and Investment Strategy, member of the Asset Management Investment Committee, was chief investment officer for the global private bank of JP Morgan. So, you know, very experienced guy. And the ultimate question in all of this is, what are the cost benefits? What are the complicating factors of trying to reach net zero of CO2? So first, let's have a look here at global greenhouse gas emissions by sector. And you can see this little blue circle here. The first section we'll look at is transportation, which is set at about 16.2% of greenhouse gas emissions. So road transport is obviously one of the higher ones here at 11.9. Aviation is actually very small when you consider how many planes there are, or were. There are 4 billion people traveling every year. Aviation is only 1.9 and shipping is only 1.7. So on balance, it would look like road transportation is the more important thing to address. And let's see how JP Morgan looks at the proposals for addressing that. So electric vehicles are deemed to be the answer. And most deep decarbonization plans involve large fleets of vehicles powered by green electricity. In the most populated countries, this is happening very slowly. So, you know, this is in contrast to what the IEA just told us, that they think in the next 9 years there's going to be 60% penetration of electric vehicles in the marketplace from about 5%. So that doesn't sound very realistic, does it? So in the most populated countries, this penetration of EVs is happening very, very slowly. And this is also affected by the rate at which the existing vehicle fleet turns over. You know, that means, like, when do you get rid of your car? If you just bought a car 5 years ago and now people are telling you, well, you should get an EV, you know, are you going to get rid of it? You might not want to. So in most developed countries, the average lives of light vehicles, light-duty vehicles, range from 10 to 23 years, or an average of about 12 years in the US market. And of course, in many countries, regulations are being implemented to prevent people from being even able to buy internal combustion engine vehicles. But it's probable that those vehicles then will stay in the market for a longer time if people prefer them. And there's lots of reasons for that. There are many aspects of electric vehicles that are not suited to certain countries, especially Canada. We have quite the extremes of temperature, from plus 40 in summer to minus 40 in winter. The distances here are very long. The population density is low, so it's expensive to install chargers everywhere for a nominal number of cars. And performance in winter, it's very difficult to maintain a charge in an EV compared to an ICE vehicle, especially like diesel vehicles or gas vehicles in winter. They're very reliable for the most part. So let's have a look and see what JP Morgan referred to. So they looked at the price gap as part of the issue. And if you look here, you'll see that for light-duty vehicles, Toyota Camry compared to a Chevy Bolt, the EVs cost 23% more. But in North America, the real comparison is between EVs and SUVs, so suburban utility vehicles. The average price of a composite of EV SUVs is 69% more expensive than a comparable internal combustion engine or ICE vehicle like a Honda CR-V. So SUVs account for 75% of US light-duty sales. So that's very, very significant. And the US market is the single largest transportation sector to decarbonize because they have the highest share of global transport energy consumption, the highest vehicle share of transport energy, the highest number of vehicles per capita at 875, the lowest public transit usage at 12%, and the lowest gasoline prices, or at least until very recently, of $3.5 per gallon, and the lowest EV market presentation. So for all these reasons, it's quite unrealistic to expect a rapid pace of EV growth in the US market. And if we look over here at this chart, just simply looking down the first column, the EV share of light vehicle sales in Australia is 1%, Canada 3%, Denmark 14%, France 9%. And I find this very surprising because France has a lot of nuclear power, so they have power to spare for electric vehicles, and they have a number of electric vehicle manufacturers. So you'd think that number would be quite a bit higher, but it's not. Germany 13%, Italy 4%, Japan 1%, the Netherlands 22%, and Norway is the big winner here at 62%. But remember, Norway, first of all, they have lots of hydro. So like France, they have power to spare, and it's relatively cheap. Likewise, it's only a population of 5 million people, and the Norwegian Sovereign Fund is a big investor in Tesla. And they also have a very large sovereign fund. They probably could give everyone a Tesla, and that would be okay. They'd probably still have money left to spare. And what else we have here is Sweden. They also run primarily on nuclear and trade hydro with Norway. So again, cheap power and lots of it. The UK only 9% and the United States only 2%. So if we consider the idea that the IEA said electric vehicle sales would go from they said that they would go from 5% to 60% in the next 9 years. That doesn't seem actually very realistic to me. Now, let's see what else we have here. So, also as part of the JP Morgan study, they refer to a recent Princeton University study on full decarbonization. And now we're going to be talking about the electricity transmission. So we're talking about the big power lines that go from hubs and from power plants, you know, the ones that are up on the big towers. So a recent study on full decarbonization would mean that the present wind and solar generation capacity would have to expand 14 times. And that would mean expanding electricity transmission capacity by 3 to 5 times. And the base cost of expanding the transmission capacity by that amount is $76 billion a year, which is 3 times higher than the current levels of transmission investment. And if you look at this chart down here, you can see these breakdowns. Texas alone would have to spend $150 billion on transmission from 2020 to 2050. California would spend over $120 billion. New Jersey, New York, and Massachusetts would be the next largest. And it's important to remember that the only thing that people who have the not in my backyard NIMBY mentality is that the only thing they hate more than pipelines are power lines. So what's the next magic thing? Like, part of the problem with some of these reports, like the NetZero report, is that they present an idea as if it's a silver bullet, as if this one thing will solve the problem. And as we know, technology takes a long time to develop, but they seem to think that if you throw enough money at it, that, you know, overnight it will be fixed. And I think at one point in one of Robert Lyman's presentations to us in 2017, he called that the Apollo fallacy. So many people often look at the Apollo missions and say, well, see, you know, this is how the US got to the moon. They kind of gave them an unlimited budget and said, do it. But all of the things about going to the moon were basically known at that time, and they used conventional power and conventional manufacturing methods to accomplish that. Of course, there were many innovations along the way, but it wasn't trying to create a whole new type of enterprise, even though going to the moon was an unknown. But what we're trying to do here is throw money at a problem where the technologies are not really market ready, and as we've seen, can't really scale up quickly enough without vast amounts of money and many complicating technical factors. So let's have a look at carbon capture and storage. So the Princeton study proposed that the building of 850 million tons of carbon dioxide storage per year, and that would be moved via 65,000 miles of pipeline infrastructure. So they're going to be capturing these carbon emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, gaseous emissions from various industries, and moving them to a place where they can sequester them underground. So they're planning on building this huge infrastructure to do that. And an important point here is that the gas would be sequestered underground and not used for enhanced oil recovery. Like to date, what's happened is that many oil companies have used carbon capture and storage, but the carbon dioxide has been pumped into depleted wells. It created better pressure there, and they were able to extract more sweet oil. So carbon capture and storage has been a real benefit for them in many ways. But now this is just being planned to be sequestered and not used for oil recovery. So if we look at the comparison of these miles of pipeline, it compares to the current US infrastructure of 5,280 miles, or 80 million tons per year of this is pipelines used for carbon dioxide capture and storage, and that is used for enhanced oil recovery. So this one has a cost benefit here. This one, it's just a cost. Of course, climate advocates would say that it's a benefit because we're reducing the amount of CO2 in the air. But let's look at this a little bit closer. Under the Princeton proposal, just to sequester an amount equal to 15% of the current U.S. annual greenhouse gas emissions would require infrastructure whose throughput volume would be higher than the volume of oil flowing through the current U.S. distribution and refining pipelines. And that system has taken over 100 years to build. And after 20 years of planning, subsidies, and political promotion, by the end of 2020, carbon capture and storage facilities stored just 0.1% of global CO2 emissions. So that's a carbon capture and storage reality check. Now, there's of course, other methods of capturing carbon dioxide, and one is called the direct air carbon capture. And there are a few different methods. So you can see a picture on one side of the screen, which is one method of carbon engineering, and then we'll discuss this other method here, which is deemed to be the most promising direct air capture method. It's based on aqueous hydroxide, and this requires vast amounts of caustic soda. So electrolysis is required to produce that caustic soda, and that would consume 25 to 40% of world energy. And hydroxide regeneration, which is used to reduce the caustic soda requirements by regenerating and reusing most of it, would claim another 11 to 17% of global primary energy. So if we put both pieces together, that caustic soda electrolysis plus regeneration would require 15 to 24% of global primary energy to capture 25% of CO2 emissions. So that doesn't sound like a win-win situation. And the last nail in the coffin is that 2,400 to 3,800 kilowatt hours per ton of captured CO2 via this direct air carbon dioxide capture would be needed before whatever energy is required to actually store the CO2 underground. So the needs of this proposed technology appear to be 6 to 10 times higher than traditional CCS energy estimates, a process itself, as we've just seen, which is stuck in neutral. So let's go back here to the global greenhouse gas emissions and by sector and see where else we might be able to make some cuts. So industry is the next biggie here. In fact, it is the biggie. It is 24.2%. So iron and steel production is 7.2, chemicals and petrochemicals 3.6. Food and tobacco is not very much, paper and pulp not much, machinery not much, other industry is 10%. So can we make cuts there? Let's go and have a look. We can see that in the JP Morgan report, which Robert Lyman put in as a highlight, we're talking about decarbonizing the industrial sector, and these two charts are split into those sectors with high electrification potential and those with medium to low electrification potential. And what that means is that there may be electrification methods where you could do similar processes to make steel or fabricated metal or machinery, secondary steel, wood products, vehicle parts, plastics or rubber. But you can see these are all at pretty high energy rates. But when you look over at the medium to low electrification potential, you find that food and beverages, chemicals, pulp and paper, non-metallic minerals, oil and coal products, the challenge is that low and medium electrification potential sectors use 2.5 times the energy as the high potential. So this sector is already using more energy than those with the highest electrification potential. So even if we assume that all sectors are eventually electrified using new technologies, which are nascent, they're not particularly widespread, there's still a large increase in cost in addition to the upfront switching costs, you'd have to change over all the infrastructure, industrial companies would face costs per unit of energy that are 3 to 6 times higher for electricity than for direct natural gas. So the cost of every single thing would skyrocket. Electric heating efficiency gains versus combustion could offset part of this cost, but not all of it. So moving along here. How about aviation? Now, we saw earlier that aviation is actually a fairly small part of emissions, but since people do love to fly, and I'm sure everyone's quite anxious to get back in the air once the COVID thing is gone, that they're keen to put in sustainable aviation fuels. And sustainable aviation fuels are not made from oil. They're made from used cooking oil, solid waste, food waste. There's less than 200,000 tons of sustainable aviation fuels produced globally, which is equal to 0.1% of commercial airlines' jet fuel consumption in 2019. So even if all the currently announced sustainable aviation fuel projects were completed, the volumes would reach just 1% of the expected global jet fuel demand in 2030. So that also does not sound very realistic. Not to mention, people might have to eat a lot of French fries to make some of the cooking oils just so that you could fly. So that doesn't sound like a good idea. Now, how about electrifying container ships? Again, as we saw, container ships are, marine shipping is a very small portion of emissions globally. So the first electrified container ship was scheduled to begin operation in 2020, but it was delayed by COVID. And it would be capable of carrying 120 20-foot equivalent units, or TEUs, at a speed of 6 knots for 30 nautical miles. But in contrast, Maersk's EE class ships carry 150 times as much cargo over distances 400 times higher at speeds 3 to 4 times faster. So given the current state of battery technology, the electric version of the Maersk ship would have to dedicate 40% of its cargo capacity to the batteries themselves. So again, we see that many of these things sound good in principle, but once you start to try and put them in practice, you see that the alleged benefits are not there, and the technical problems are often almost insurmountable. So that doesn't mean that we should stop trying to innovate. Of course, we should continue doing that, but it does mean that we have to take a look at reports like the NetZero report that the IEA just issued, and really take a good look at it and make sure that we do a full cost benefit analysis. Because unfortunately, what's happening is when these grand promotions come out, like the thing that I mentioned at the beginning, the article in the Telegraph, where people are saying, oh, we'll have 8 times the jobs and it'll be fantastic, it'll be free energy. These are very enticing. The markets go crazy thinking, oh, fantastic, we're going to jump on the next potential winner in the marketplace. And conventional markets are being destroyed in this way. Some people say, oh, well, that's good. Oh, really? Well, how are you going to make any of these things if you don't have oil, gas, and coal? Like every single one of the technologies that's been discussed here all require conventional fuel to make every piece of machinery, every form of technology, every form of pipe. The embedded emissions for all of these projects will be extremely high. So embedded emissions mean that, when you're building something, like there's an example that I recall on the Portland LRT. And someone did an analysis of the British thermal units of energy used in the building of this fairly short line. And they found that it would take 172 years to sort of recoup that energy in terms of the people using it and, you know, the so-called benefits of taking cars off the road. So these are the kinds of things that people have to look at very critically and not just assume that, oh, well, you know, it's a report. It says it'll work. Let's assume that it will. Let's proceed here. So how about converting methane from waste into gas equivalents? And again, this sounds like a great idea. So is methane from waste, or so-called renewable natural gas, RNG, a major alternative to conventional hydrocarbons? It does sound like a good idea to, you know, reuse, recycle kind of thinking. The US RNG volumes are in the range of 200 to 300 million gallons per year. So the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, the NREL, estimates that the potential production of RNG from landfills, agricultural waste, wastewater, and other organic waste could be up to 4.8 billion gasoline gallon equivalents, or GGE. But to put that in context, in 2019, 142 billion gallons of gasoline were consumed in the United States. So thus, RNG could offset about maybe 2.5% of annual US gasoline demand. And this is without considering the undoubtedly much higher costs of the RNG. So in conclusion, the JP Morgan 2021 annual energy paper concludes that the direct use of fossil fuels is still the primary mover in the modern world. And as the demise of fossil fuels continues to be prematurely declared by energy futurists, rapid decarbonization is bound to fail for technological, economic, and political reasons. And future parts of this series, which Robert Lyman will be preparing, will expand on the reasons why. So I invite you to read our report. You know, don't just take my word for granted. I tried to give you a simplified overview, sort of the man on the street kind of insights. But you can read Robert's report and get more detail there, or you can read the JP Morgan report. All these materials will be posted on our blog with links to all of these things, including, we'll include a link to the IEA report, and you can have a gander at that as well. I'd like to remind you that you can join Friends of Science if you like the work that we do and the fact that we're bringing these things forward to the public. Please feel free to donate. Feel free to share our stuff. You know, we are a small group. I am the spokesperson for Friends of Science, but behind me there's a dedicated team of volunteers who really make it all happen. So if you can support us, we'd be very grateful. We'd like to continue bringing you these kinds of insights, and we're very grateful to Robert Lyman for the many contributions that he's made. We've got lots of excellent reports by Robert on our website, on our blog, and referred to in many of our videos, and we've got some short video interviews with Robert Lyman on our YouTube site. So I hope you'll take advantage of the knowledge that he has. Just to give you a bit of background, Robert Lyman was a federal public servant for 27 years, and before that he was a diplomat for 10 years. So he's got very good insights into policy issues and how these technologies have progressed over the years. So I think that it's worthwhile learning from his experience. And just before we go to the Q&A part, if you have been sending questions in the chat, or if you have anything you'd like to know a bit more about, let's go back and remember why are we doing this in the first place? Well, of course, net zero goals are all based on the theory that carbon dioxide from human industry drives climate change. But does it? I think that everyone should be asking that question, because for about the past 20 years now, we've had no statistically significant warming, even though we've had a very dramatic rise in carbon dioxide concentration. Even during the COVID shutdown, carbon dioxide concentration rose, even though human industrial emissions dropped about 8%. but carbon dioxide concentration continued to rise. So we're hoping that people will come around to the idea that the sun is the main driver of climate change, not you and not carbon dioxide. And we have lots of climate science materials on our website, and it's staged in various levels. If you're not really scientifically inclined, we invite you to have a look at the interviews that we have on our website. We've got a lot of short interviews with popular speakers like Patrick Moore. We've got a few longer presentations by him. We've got scientific presentations by Dr. Madhav Kandekar, the Connollys, by Dr. Willie Soon. We had a number of scientists that I interviewed at the Porto conference in 2018 from around the world. Quite an international collection there. So I hope that you'll take advantage of those. If you're more scientifically inclined, we have lots of links to scientific papers. And if you do become a member of Friends of Science Society, you will be receiving our bi-weekly CLI-SCI, which is a summary of recent academic papers and peer-reviewed papers on climate science, and Extracts, which is a summary of recent sort of political and energy issues that you probably won't see in the mainstream. So a lot of the things that we cover are headline news in other countries around the world, but they're not covered by the Canadian media. So we hope that you'll take advantage of the insights that we offer in that regard. And as a member of Friends of Science, you'll also have access to our online events. And I will make an announcement right now. We are going to be opening up our recent event, which was paywalled, but we're going to be opening up the Dr. Roy Spencer No Climate Emergency and Donna Laframboise Freedom of Speech online video presentations. So you'll be able to access that in the next week or so. And I hope that you'll really enjoy it. So we'll just go to our last slide here. And that is a little bit about us. So we've been doing this for about 18 years. We're actually going into our 19th year now. In that time, we've continued to operate as a volunteer-run nonprofit society. We operate on about $150,000 a year from our members, and our member donors are individuals. We're not funded by big oil, and we're not funded by big anything. So we rely on the support of people who care about the future for their children, people who want to have an open civil debate on climate and energy policies, and people who don't want to end up in the poorhouse. You can see there's a little donate button here. You can also find that on our homepage. So let's go back here to hello. So if you have questions, please send them on. I'm just going to see if I have any questions here from my colleagues. I see we have a number of things here. Linda's just saying that Donna Laframboise has done very interesting research on the IPCC, and that's true. In fact, if you look on our event page, you can see that in 2012, Donna Laframboise was our guest speaker, and she did the whole breakdown of her book on the UN IPCC. And she found that, ironically, World Wild Fund, WWF, which Gerald Butts used to be the president of WWF Canada, or the CEO, they and Greenpeace turned out to be lead authors in the IPCC reports. So they've been highly influenced by these ENGOs, which brings into question the objectivity. And we've also found in the ClimateGate emails, you can find ClimateGate emails where the WWF is telling scientists, like, we don't think that that is going to be spicy enough. You better ratchet it up a little bit more. So these are important things to consider, because Governments are setting policy, climate policy, based on what the IPCC tells them. And if the IPCC in turn is being directed by these environmental groups, some of which are proxies for commercial interests, should we be following that advice? Isn't that anti-democratic? They're kind of breaching national sovereignty and effectively jumping the line to get their materials out. I'm just going to check here and see if I've got any incoming. Okay, I don't have any questions yet. Let's see what else. Someone's asking if we're going to Glasgow. I'm not going to Glasgow. The Glasgow is where COP26 is going to be, and that's referring to the Conference of the Parties. The Conference of the Parties refers to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the organization that began at the Rio Conference in Brazil in 1992. So the Conference of the Parties have been meeting every year since then. So this is going to be their 26th year. And every time they have a historic, unprecedented arrangement and an agreement, and how wonderful, we're going to stop emitting. And all you can see is the CO2 emissions going up and up every year. Basically, these arrangements have consisted of a lot of bribes to developing countries. One of the bribes that many people are not aware of is called the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund was offered to developing nations $100 billion a year, which would be drawn from you people in the West and given without any accountability requirement to these developing nations to allegedly catch up with us. What it really is kind of a recycling plan that money would go to these nations. They in turn would buy renewable technology or various other instruments from Western nations. So it would just be recycling money, but draining it from your pocket. And as we know, the IMF and the World Bank have refused to lend money to projects in developing nations where they could get a coal plant, for instance, like in Africa. And in Africa, Samuel Fafari has written a book called The Urgency of Electrification in Africa. If you can imagine, people there are still living hand to mouth for the most part, very poor electrical infrastructure. And there are a lot of green billionaires who are capitalizing on the poorest people of the earth. They're selling them a solar panel on a kind of a lend-lease program so they can charge their cell phone and have a bit of light at night in their house. All good and well, except the interest rates are astronomical, something like 1,200%. These are the poorest people in the world, and they've also got a turn-off chip in the thing. So if you don't pay your bill on time, they cut you off. Now, wouldn't it be better to build them a coal plant or a gas plant so that they could have, central infrastructure for electricity? They could have pumped water. They could have sanitation like we have in the West. It's really criminal, I think, that they're being denied these opportunities because we in the West are so busy being green. But we don't mind that people in Africa are still dying because they're cooking their food over an open flame in their hut and breathing in all those toxic elements. So let's see, what else do we have? Yes, if we go to net zero CO2, we will all be dead. Anne Brown just wrote that. Yep, that's true. And, we're actually at a very low rate of carbon dioxide now. Patrick Moore has talked about this a lot. The fact that, historically, carbon dioxide has almost never been this low. And if it goes below 150 parts per million, all the plants will die and so will we. So the idea of drawing carbon dioxide from the air seems rather silly. What we've seen in the past few years with the addition of carbon dioxide from industrial emissions, there's been what's called CO2 fertilization, meaning that crops around the world have proliferated. Plant life has proliferated. Parts of the Sahara have greened. So, there's actually been visible benefit from the enhancement of carbon dioxide. And I think one other thing to consider is that's not talked about. One of the fears of carbon dioxide being in the atmosphere is based on outdated science. So people originally thought that carbon dioxide's residency time was thousands of years. But Dr. Ian Clark has found that the residency time of CO2 in the atmosphere is maybe 4 to 5 years. And you can see that in the film Global Warning by Matthew Embry. We have a link to that on our website. We have some interviews with Matthew. But he actually goes to Dr. Clark's lab and talks with him. And if you can believe it, Dr. Clark actually brought Catherine Abreu, who is the executive director of the Canadian Climate Action Network of Canada, a very influential climate activist. He actually brought her to Dr. Clark's lab, showed her that carbon dioxide has a very short residency, so it's not going to pile up like blankets and blankets and blankets that warm and boil the world. And she didn't believe him. So he's the scientist, she's the activist. Anyway, you should watch the film and see. Matthew did a very good job of making it quite balanced. He has very different points of view in there. What else do we have here? Yes, you'll own nothing and then be hunted. Yeah, someone's talking here about the World Economic Forum's theme of it's 2030, I own nothing and I'm happy. I don't know about that. So, yes, Dick Hanton is saying 9 out of 10 Canadians hear and sadly believe only one side. Well, and you know why? Because we are severely restricted in the media. Basically, most media are participants in what's called the Covering Climate Now campaign, which is done by the Columbia Journalism Review. And actually, you know what? I'm just going to go and get the booklet because I have it here so you can see it. Just hang on. Because it's hard to believe until you see how bright orange this cover is. So, Covering Climate Now is a project of Columbia Journalism Review, and that used to be a great journalism school, but now it seems to be one engaged in propaganda. So you can see that they've printed all these pages in bright orange, and they've engaged more than 400 outlets worldwide have joined the Covering Climate Now. Their combined reach is more than 2 billion people. And basically everything that they do is all about the world burning up. And in this wonderful publication, who do they interview? Do you think they interview a climate scientist? No, they go to the director of Mad Max, and he affirms, where is that? Here. The director of Mad Max tells Kyle Pope how to make climate fear compelling. So this is modern day journalism. Anyway, so anything that we try to put forward is far too rational for mainstream media. Certainly none of the Covering Climate Now people will ever publish our materials. So we're very glad that people do tune into our social media channels and share our materials. Let's see. Climate alarmists behave like they belong to a cult. That's true. Yeah, you can read a lot on psychology about cults, and all the parameters are there. So I just have to look at I have some questions here, if you can just pause while I bring them up. Okay. Okay, the chart of materials didn't include cement, and that's true. I think it's probably going to be in a subsequent issue of Robert Lyman's work, but it's probably in the J.P. Morgan report. Is the car comparison prices with or without subsidies to EVs? Honestly, I don't know. Wondering about transport trucks, semis, and other large vehicles in regard to EVs. Many businesses have switched away from rail transport and gone with transports. I don't see EV working for Canada. The big problem, as I understand it, with EVs for trucks is that the battery for a truck that's an EV is so big that it takes away from the carrying capacity for the transport. And the other problem with that is that, if you load up a truck with a bunch of, gallons and gallons of diesel, and then you burn it as you go along, your truck is actually getting lighter, but you still have the same power. If you have an electric vehicle that's a truck, it has a very big, heavy battery, and as you go along, the battery loses power, but the battery itself retains the same weight. So unlike a gas or diesel vehicle, which lightens its load as it burns its fuel, the reverse happens with an electric vehicle, and in a truck that is completely detrimental to the whole purpose of truck transport. EVs are probably great for around town. I think that the Alberta government did a great thing a few years ago, and that is back in around 2003, they implemented a climate change plan for Alberta, which most people have forgotten about. And one of the programs that they had was called Hail a Hybrid. So they encouraged all the taxi fleets in Alberta to switch to hybrid vehicles. And I think that really did help, and it reduced pollution in the cities. But hybrid vehicles are very economical to run, and they can work on gas when they're on a longer run and work on electricity when they're in the city. So that seems to be a good option for Canada. But straight EVs, the costs are astronomical. And we've got a couple of short blog posts on our website. One where we challenge CTV and the math myths on EVs, because they also have astronomical projections about when Alberta will magically jump from almost a handful of EVs to 600,000 in the space of 5 years. So we've got that there. And Robert Lyman also did a 3-part series on false expectations about EVs. That's also on our blog. Are we no further advanced in extracting hydrogen feasibly? And I know they were starting to make hydrogen cars. Hydrogen is a very interesting and challenging issue. And I recommend, that people look at the work of Samuel Farfari. He's a professor, he's a chemist, he's in Belgium, and he was also an energy advisor to the EU for about 36 years. And he worked on trying to implement hydrogen as an alternative fuel for decades. And he found that it just can't be done. We've got a couple of posts on our blog by him, and one of them is called Hydrogen, I Believed. So, it sounds good in principle, but some of the problems with hydrogen is that it takes energy to make hydrogen. And you're constantly losing energy as you're making this hydrogen. Another factor is that it's extremely difficult to handle. In industrial settings, there are applications for it, but in those settings, there's instrumental monitoring, which is very important because it's an invisible gas, doesn't have a smell, and you can't add a smell to it. And it's the smallest molecule. So hydrogen can actually escape a metal tank, it also has a quality to it that embrittles metal, so it makes it very brittle and easy to break. And because of the nature of the molecule, it has to be stored at extremely high pressure. So this is a catastrophe in the making. And add to that the energy required to make it is significantly high. Now, we do need hydrogen and we do need to make it, and we will continue to make it, but probably its application will be for fertilizer and other industrial applications. It is very unlikely, I think it would be extremely dangerous to consider using it to heat homes. It's far more explosive than natural gas. There are some hydrogen fuel cell cars and buses out there. Again, all those factors, the processing of the hydrogen, the storing of it in extremely high pressurized containers, these are not the best suited things for a consumer population. And on a site out of Europe, there's an article called "Pushing Hydrogen out of the industrial use and into the consumer market and the dangers of it." And an engineer goes through and talks about how extremely dangerous this can be. People just don't realize it. And unfortunately, all the venture capital people are now talking about, you see Mark Carney saying, oh, well, we can just move into hydrogen. No, we can't. Not just like that. It's very dangerous, very complicated, and it's a loss of energy. That's actually the biggest thing. I think Professor Fufari puts it this way. He says, using hydrogen to heat homes is like burning Louis Vuitton handbags to keep warm. So he's got a few real good gems like that. Let's see, what's another question here? How about floating thermoelectric generators? Okay, you've got me there. I've never heard of that. So, do we have enough water? Well, we have, the Earth is covered in 71% water, oceans, so possibly. Okay, let's see if we have any other questions here. So, is this the kind of information that you want, that you can use? Are there other things that you're interested in from us? Because, we're always happy to get feedback. You can write to me at media@friendsofscience.org or to our main office at contact@friendsofscience.org. We would like to know what kind of things people need to know, and we can also direct you to some of our publications because we've covered most of the territory over the past 19 years. So, we're happy to offer you those resources. Let's see if we have some questions here. Are there any CPC MPs that are aware of the facts? I don't know. It's very difficult with all politicians because we have a set of 4 reports by Robert Lyman on the power of the environmental groups. And I don't know if you've seen them, but they're on our blog, and we can post the link in this same blog so that you can easily find it, the same blog related to this conversation tonight. For instance, between 2000 and 2018, the top 40 environmental groups in Canada, most of which are federally registered charities, had revenues that were 18 times the revenues of all political parties, federal political parties in Canada combined. 18 times. So, imagine that power. And more recently, and these people are being funded by you, by tax subsidies, because they're federally registered charities for the most part. And more recently, under Bill Morneau, these groups were granted the right to use 100% of their revenues for political activities. Before, it was limited to 10%. But there was an article by Mark Bloomberg of what's it called? He runs a charity law firm. He deals exclusively on charities issues. I can't remember the name of it. But Mark Bloomberg wrote that under the 10% rule, the various charities in Canada, and this would include all charities, not just the ENGOs, but they would have had $25 billion available to them to spend on political issues. And now the number is astronomical, and you can find out those numbers by reading our reports on the ENGOs. So this is why most politicians, play the green side, because these ENGOs have built up vast empires and networks. They have huge social media followings. They can put up a point-and-click campaign, and boom, within a day or two, they'll have 30, 50,000 people writing their MP and saying, do this, do that. We don't have anything like that, and we don't do that kind of thing. Well, we rely on individuals taking our information to whatever elected official may be out there and expressing their view. They may agree with us, they may disagree. We don't care. We just want people to be informed. So obviously there are most of the political parties are trying to play along with these environmental groups. But I think really you need to be contacting like the Canada Revenue Agency and asking, why are we funding people who are putting us out of work, especially in Alberta? 100,000 people or more out of work in Alberta because these environmental groups, many of which have been funded from offshore, have waged campaigns against this industry here. And as I pointed out in the presentation tonight, even if the IEA says, oh yes, no more fossil fuels, what are they going to make all their wind farms from? What are they going to make their solar panels from? You need oil, gas, and coal to make any of those things, and you need lots of it. So, these are ludicrous suggestions that are being made, not well thought out, and they don't provide any cost-benefit analysis, right? So these ENGOs have been beating the drum for these kinds of projects, clean tech, etc., and never realizing that, in fact, the more clean tech you build, the more oil, gas, and coal you'll use. Now let's see, what else do we have here? Okay. Phil Chambers is saying we're in the latest grand solar minimum already. We'll be needing more cheap energy over the next 25 to 30 years, and modern nuclear reactors are going to be the only wise and practical adaptation. Well, I generally agree with that. We do have a presentation on our blog from Russia. It's Dr. Habibulov Abdusamatov. He's with the Pulkalov Observatory in Russia, and he also participates in or leads a very important part of the International Space Station work. So he's not some tinfoil hatter in a basement. In his PowerPoint, he shows that total solar irradiance is dropping and that we are in fact going into a solar minimum, which he believes will last for several decades. So you can have a look at that on our blog. The title is Russian Scientist, I just can't remember the total title, but if you look under Russian Scientist on our blog, it will pop up because that's the only one. What else do we have here? Hello, Texas. It was snowing a bit in Calgary today. Yep, that's right. Oh, we've got a few more questions here. Let me just have a look. Sorry if this isn't as slick. Any advice on how we can get the CPC back on track? Are there any allies in the House of Commons? I think somehow we have to just demand as citizens an open civil debate on climate and energy policies, and not necessarily from any particular party, but in general. And in fact, Jonathan Wilkinson, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, suggested that in his comments on the CPC climate plan. He said that we need an adult debate. So I think we should take him up on that offer. The only allies in the House of Commons who share a similar view on climate change and the Paris Agreement would be Derek Sloan is one, and of course Maxime Bernier and the People's Party of Canada. They came to their own conclusions. I don't know who provided them with material, but they perhaps knew by looking at the Paris Agreement that it's really an empty agreement, and it would be economically devastating for Canada to go down that road. Do you folks know that Bill Gates has a place near Pemberton, BC that's trying to suck CO2 out of the air? Yes, I don't know where it is, but now you tell me where it is. In the PowerPoint, there was an image of the carbon engineering technology, and that is associated with Bill Gates and David Keith. Are there any CPC MPs that are aware of the facts? I see that Candace Bergen is following you on Twitter. Well, we put our information out there, and it's really up to those members of Parliament who choose to look into it, or you, our audience, to share that information with them, to tell them what you think, to ask them to, reconsider their position. I think a lot of times people go along to get along. I think a lot of politicians also, just like ordinary citizens, they've been lobbied a lot by these environmental groups. And the presentation always sounds very slick. Like, what did we have from this fellow that was in the Telegraph? He just told us that the IEA plans are tantamount to free energy. That sounds fantastic. But is it free? People fall for these lines because some of these activists are very good salespeople. Some of them are very good fear mongers. When people come to you and say, listen, I'm afraid for my children, they're going to die of climate change and it'll be my fault. And that's sort of the whole story that Greta's been telling people. It's hard to get those people to calm down and actually either listen to the facts or explain the facts that they know. Because once they start to explain the facts that they know, then you can discuss it with them. So I think a lot of politicians go along to get along. If you look at Bill C-12, which is the NetZero target bill, where they want to set climate accountability so that every 5 years the government has to meet these targets in the Paris Agreement. And by the way, the Paris Agreement is voluntary. If you look at all the parties, we're in agreement with that. Because, it sounds like a good idea. Like the climate activists have said, Canada has missed every one of its targets since the beginning of the COP meetings. That's true. So has every other country in the world. The European Union has, to a certain degree, managed to reduce their emissions. But how do they do that? They moved all their industry offshore. The UK, a lot of industry in the UK moved to China or India. So that's not really removing emissions. It's moving industry and jobs. But it didn't remove any emissions from the atmosphere, but it does make your country look good. So, I don't think people look very deeply into these things and consider the consequences. So the Bill C-12 would be really destructive for Canada. If you want to see more about that, look at the live stream that we did about a month ago. It's posted on our website. I think we did it on April the 15th. But it's called A Cruel and Unusual Punishment. And that's what Bill C-12 and the federal climate policy would impose upon you. Cruel and unusual punishment. And I mean it. So you can read our report as well and see why we say that. What else do we have here? Yes, what we could do with all this money to take down and clean up the rivers and oceans. Yes, exactly. There's so much money being wasted on green crony capitalism. So many people getting rich on renewable energy certificates, and they're really just vacuuming that money from your pocket into theirs. And there's no benefit to the environment, no benefit to climate change. So somehow we have to stop it. I mean, ultimately it'll stop because we'll all be broke, but it would be better to stop it before that. What else do we have here? Um, so, yes. Okay. Oh, does Aaron O'Toole know anything about climate change? He's going to change his name to Carbon because he makes up everything. Well, it was very surprising to see the Conservative Party's climate platform, and we are working on a report to rebut it because it's really going nowhere climate plan. And having a savings account that you can't spend except on somebody else's green technology is just as bad or worse than a carbon tax. Anything else here? Oh, yes, there's a Freedom Talk coming up in the fall, so that should be interesting. I don't know if you are aware of Freedom Talk. I've been a speaker there a few times. We have a couple of videos on our YouTube page from those Freedom Talks, and you can also go to the Freedom Talk website and see all of their videos. So the people behind that are principally John Robson and Danny Hozak, and they always get a really interesting group of speakers. Well, maybe that's maybe I'm not as interesting as some of them, but you know, they try to have a very broad spectrum of speakers and on topics that are not discussed in the mainstream media, certainly not in the fullest detail. So I hope that you can have a look at Freedom Talk and see what they're up to. So, okay, great. This is great. We're starting to get some emails from individuals on things that they want to talk about. So I'd be very happy to deal with those. So I think that we've pretty much answered the questions that we see here. Oh, I see Henry Engelking has Bjorn Lomberg has clearly demonstrated that the cost to stop climate change, if that was possible, is many times more expensive than adapting to climate change, and why has his message not been heard? Well, again, the media lockout, again, this crazy Covering Climate Now conglomeration of media people from around the world who only sing from the same song sheet, climate catastrophe. I mean, look at this publication. It's printed in orange. That's not journalism. That's propaganda. So, and there's no opposing views in here. I don't know if you know, but there's a group called Clintel, which is more than 900 scientists and scholars from around the world, and they have assessed the climate science, and they say there's no climate emergency. Now, I have several editions of the Columbia Journalism Review, and they've never interviewed anyone from Clintel. They've never written about it. So if they're actually supposedly covering climate now, where is it? Why are they interviewing the director of Mad Max, who is giving them tips on how to make climate fear more fearful, rather than talking to a scientist who's going to help people calm down and understand the natural processes behind climate change? Doesn't make any sense. So I think we're getting to the end of the evening here. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. I'd like to remind you all that you can become a member of Friends of Science. You can go to our homepage, friendsofscience.org, and you'll see the membership and donate button up in the corner. And if you become a member, then there are certain benefits, and one of them is getting our CLI-SCI and our extract newsletters. You can also unsubscribe from either if you prefer one or the other. Some people are more interested in the science, some are more interested in politics and energy. And we'd like to open the debate on climate and energy policies, and you're the people who can do that. And it's time that we have a down-to-earth, as Jonathan Wilkinson said, adult debate on climate and energy policies. Stop name-calling, no demonizing, And we need to do a full cost benefit analysis. Just in the brief number of slides I showed you tonight, you can see that these promises that people are making are absurdly expensive, and are fraught with many technical problems that haven't been properly thought out. So it's really up to you to carry this message forward to your elected officials, to your community leaders, to your friends, family, and colleagues. And there's no reason for people to be calling anyone names for any reason, because these are crucial issues. As people have noted here, we're going into a solar minimum, and we will need affordable, reliable energy. Reliable energy. We don't want to end up like Texas. So it's really important that people speak up now. COP26 is coming up in the fall, in November. They're going to try and push through a global carbon tax. So that's something that would be extremely destructive to Canada and democracy. Some of the climate activists in the world, like at the Deutsche Bank, for instance, they want to impose an eco-dictatorship to push through climate policies. So it's very important that people speak up now and say no to climate CO2 coercion. So on that note, I'm just going to thank you all for tuning in tonight. Thanks for all your comments here. I'll have fun having a look at all of them after. And I look forward to our next live stream. If you want to send in some suggestions on what topics you'd like to see, feel free to do so either in the chat right now or in the comments under the recorded version. And thanks again. And I hope that we also all recover from COVID, and to those of you who have lost people due to this terrible pandemic, our condolences to all of you. So I hope that going forward, we're going to have a much better 2021. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm going to sign off now. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling. Thank you.